Hello, and welcome to Climate Fix Podcast. Here we dive into evidence based solutions to climate change and various other pressing environmental issues. This is your host, Phil Ord.
And this is your co host, Colby Kirk. This podcast is created by Americans for Nuclear Energy, a pro nuclear environmental organization. We take no money from industry or special interest groups. All donations are from individuals like you, interested in a grassroots scientific movement to solve the world's most pressing scientific problem: global climate change. We hope you approach these ideas with humanism and an open mind.
Our mission statement is as follows: nuclear energy is safe, cheap, plentiful, clean, and efficient. It has the capability to stop and reverse climate change while addressing the ever growing demand for electricity globally. We strive to educate American citizens about this technology and to dispel misconceptions with facts. We firmly believe that both human civilization and industrialism can easily coexist with a healthy environment.
Join us in helping to plan a prescription for a feverish planet, or as we like to say, a climate fix.
This episode is called A New Type of Climate Activism. Basically, climate activism today seems to be very vocal and involve a lot of disruption with very little concrete solutions. And I think that's what's causing a lot of animosity towards many of the activists. Activism is needed to make progress on the greenhouse gas emission issue. However, it has to be evidence based and pragmatic. If not, it's just a bunch of talk. Our guest today is Zion Lights, here to talk about a new type of climate activism, as she is a veteran environmental activist and climate change warrior. She has parted ways a bit with traditional climate activists in her vocal support of nuclear power as a solution. Here's a little bit about Zion.
So Xeon is a former spokesperson and media coordinator for Extinction Rebellion UK and editor of Extinction Rebellion's Hourglass newspaper. She has written for The Metro, The City AM, BBC Wildlife Magazine, and Resurgence, among others. She's recently made headlines for her outspoken support and advocacy for nuclear energy as an essential role in combating climate change. She's had numerous media appearances, including BBC World News, The Andrew Neil Show, Politics Live, and Good Morning Britain.
She's the author of the book, The Ultimate Guide to Green Parenting, and Only a Moment, in addition to a new book coming out called Zero Waste Kids. In 2018, she gave a talk at TEDx University of Bristol called Don't Forget to Look Up. It's about stargazing, changing the way we look at the world, and how to contemplate one's place in the universe.
The Daily Telegraph called her Britain's greenest mother. The Guardian praised her for being an eco pragmatist, happily heavy on science. She has a master's in science communication from the University of West England and recently became the director of Environmental Progress UK, a pro nuclear energy environmental group.
That is a lot of accomplishments. It's going to be so fun to talk to her. I mean, clearly, this lady's been in the trenches when it comes uh, to basically saving the planet in any way possible. I'm very excited to talk to her because I think we need to really rethink the way we approach trying to get progress done on the emissions issue. It's basically just a bunch of governments yelling and talking, activists yelling and talking, wanting to shut everything down. Clearly, this is not how society will operate. We need solutions and we need them fast. And there is no time for dogmatism. We know what the problem is. And I believe we channel the problem and the solution into a very specific type of climate activism. How about you, Colby?
Yeah, I think this is an important story because what Xeon is doing is really showcasing what will need to happen with a lot of people. Casual climate activists and also high-profile people like Xeon, who publicly come out and say, "Hey, nuclear is essential for fixing this problem." Nuclear is one of the most misunderstood technologies. It has some of the highest potential to fix the problems that we're facing, not just in fixing climate change, but also fixing poverty at the same time. And it takes a lot of courage to come out and say, hey, this is what the science is. The nuclear we'd be building today is not the nuclear from 40 years ago. A lot of the arguments against nuclear don't hold the water that thought they might. And it really takes stories like Xeon's for that to move forward. We've sort of seen this before, kind of with George Monbiot or James Hansen, for instance. The icons of environmentalism and climate activism are coming out and saying, "Hey, we need nuclear. We aren't going to fix this problem by beating the drum of the old green narrative." And that's a very important message to send. And not only does that sort of make headlines and give visibility to this issue and put nuclear on the table where it needs to be examined, but it also will help others who are in positions who might be realizing that nuclear is the answer, or might know that nuclear is the answer, but they're just quiet about it now. And being a science communicator in her position, I think we're going to have a very interesting discussion about this.
Exactly. Well, without any further ado, here's our conversation with Xeon Lights. Xeon, thanks for coming on the show.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for having me.
So, Zion, after writing your first book called The Ultimate Guide to Green Parenting, you went back to school to get a master's in science communication. What led to this decision?
Ultimately, it was to do with my book, the response that I had to my book. So, The Ultimate Guide to Green Parenting came about because as a new parent, I found it very difficult to work out what the evidence based ways were to raise children with a low carbon footprint. So, I'd been living with quite a low carbon footprint myself for a long time. But when it came to doing it as a parent, I just heard so many, what I can only describe as myths, so many ideas thrown at me that weren't backed by evidence. So I started researching the evidence, and some of it, the myths um, kind of held up to evidence, and some of them were just completely the opposite of where they needed to be. So I started, doing more and more research, and people became very interested in it, and asking me, well, how did you, research getting this bike with a child seat for for your daughter, what's the best way to do things, and so I pitched it to a publisher and they accepted it, and it had a chapter on transport, and it had a chapter on diet and things like weaning, and it also had a chapter on vaccines, and I felt that it was really important to have that in there because I don't separate social justice issues from environmental issues. I think it's very much the same thing. And what I didn't anticipate, even though I have friends and had friends then who are anti-vaccination, what I didn't anticipate was just the strength of the response because of that chapter. So I had all kinds of emails from people saying, great book. This chapter's helped me with weaning, or with transport, but I don't like your chapter on vaccines. That was the sort of response I was getting from people, and I would respond and say, the scientific method that informs the other chapters is exactly the same in that chapter. And then I'd get kind of people saying no, because those scientists are involved with big pharma and all these kind of conspiracies coming out. And some of the mail was quite bad. I would describe it as hate mail. And yeah, I just was kind of like,
Fair.
wow, maybe I should have known that this was going to elicit such a strong response, but I didn't really until that foray into the anti-vax community. And I thought, well, some of these people are my friends. I want to be able to talk to them about this without it just becoming, a polarized us versus them kind of thing. And I want that, I want them to understand that this is what the evidence says, and that the book was absolutely not telling people how to live. It was just showing them what the data is. So if you look at the chapter on vaccines, it's not me making a strong case for why you should vaccinate. It's me explaining why people vaccinate, and how it works. And so I thought, well, maybe that's not reaching people the way that I wanted it to. I mean, it did reach the kind of target audience of people who they were curious to know more, and they wanted that information. But there's this whole other group out there that needs to be communicated with in a different way. So that was really why I went back to university to do a master's, and I chose UE, University of West of England, because a lot of the kind of research that I saw in science communication comes out of that department. They have a really great program there, and yeah, I learned a lot about kind of the science of communicating science, basically. Another thing I'd add on that is that, that even as a journalist, for many years before my book came out, I did science writing, and there's no requirement for science writers to have any kind of training in the field. And so that often as well, can lead to, as I'm sure most listeners to this podcast are aware, can lead to all kinds of problems with misrepresenting evidence. Is not always intentional. So it's really imperative for me to actually study it and work out, what is the best way to speak to people who have different views than you, or views that are, like fundamentally in opposition to what evidence is telling us.
Well, science communication as a field is certainly important, and there is plenty to learn from it. So, how would you say you see the larger field of science communication engaging with the topic of nuclear energy?
Nuclear energy really needs a rebrand. This is what I often say to people. If you look at renewables, or you think about renewables, most of us have this great image of kind of the sun shining and the wind blowing, the really positive branding, when actually the reality, is that they still require resources, they still require manufacture, and they take up a lot of space, or wind farms take up a lot of space. And with nuclear, it's the opposite way around, where there are lots of good things. Nuclear has a potential to help lift people out of poverty, without pumping more greenhouse gas emissions into the atmosphere from fossil fuels like we did, which then can tackle climate change. Also, could play a really important role in air pollution. And unpicking all of those issues in people's minds is a huge it's just a huge task at the moment. It really just nuclear needs more advocates. It needs people. So people often say to me, why don't you speak out for renewables? It's exactly what I just said, that it doesn't need people to do that. In fact, what needs to happen is there needs to be a balance. We need to be able to criticize renewables where it's appropriate. um, like, for example, I don't know if anyone's seen this recently in the news, but kind of indigenous tribe living in Norway has been, taking people to court over wind farms that are proposed, a wind farm that's proposed that would just, consume quite a lot of the land. I mean, these things, they do take up a lot of space.
They do.
And as soon as I started speaking about that, people just really, it's really kind of laid into me, why are you criticizing renewables? And I said, well, we have to be able to just have a realistic discussion about,
No energy
about,
is yep.
yeah.
No
And
energy is perfect.
exactly. And then they say, well, you don't do it about nuclear. And I say, well, I am happy to do it about nuclear, but the thing is, nuclear only has criticisms. People have so many criticisms, so I'm trying to balance it by talking about, the good elements, which are not talked about, like air pollution, like poverty eradication. These are really important points. I think climate change people tend to kind of get, but the other things, they're equally important. So really, we need more science communicators in nuclear. And what's exciting for me is that a lot of people are now coming out and doing it more, and there's kind of a community building around it. And I hope that that will help to change public perception of nuclear.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and in my opinion, the journalism around nuclear is pretty abysmal because there's just there's not enough trained science writers, in my opinion, and that's why science communication as a degree I didn't even know it existed is pretty awesome, and I'm glad you went that route because you're right. Nuclear does need more science communication advocates and because it really just has a branding issue. So
It's quite a new thing as well, science communication. The unit that I studied at is one of the few in the world. People come from the world over to study there. And as I say, a lot of the research in the field comes from that department. But the need for it. People recognise the growing need for it, and we have a medical school here at the university, and I met one of the science writers from that team, who would write kind of the press releases of the groundbreaking research they're doing. in that department, and she wrote something that was misunderstood or maybe deliberately misinterpreted by the press, that led to national headlines, and she felt so awful about it that she'd come on this course to learn how to avoid that happening. And since then, they've now set up a science communication department in the medical department at the university. So I think it's growing all the time, and it's that's a really great thing. It's really positive. It can't develop quickly enough, in my opinion.
Definitely. Well, moving on, you know, we're starting to get into kind of the activism part of this conversation. There's an impression many people have with climate activists is that they have a constant talk of disaster with no real concrete solutions put forward besides some vague, radical restructuring of society. Would you agree with this criticism?
Yes and no. So what I would say about Extinction Rebellion, for example, um, they have they have some good ideas, and one of their demands is for citizens' assemblies to decide policy instead of politicians, because they say it's a more true form of democracy. They say that it would be more difficult for vested interests to play a hand. And there is some research behind this. Before I kind of supported that demand, I did some research, and citizen assemblies have been found to work in this way in different parts of the world. So potentially that is a kind of maybe it is quite radical, but I think it is an evidence-based kind of solution that one day could work in society. But then at the same time, um is are we going to have a radical restructuring in time to tackle what's happening to the planet? At the same time, we're calling for net zero by 2050. Policy needs to be made now. I don't think we really have time to try and fix all of the problems and then say, right, let's deal with those greenhouse gas emissions. So I think kind of there's a bit of a contradiction in that demand. But at the same time, I would say I kind of like the idealism of it. I kind of like that people come together and they try and present something just fresh, evidence-based. And the critical thing for me with the citizen assemblies is they say, so it's like a jury system, right? It's like we already use a jury system over here in courts, and it's people sitting down, listening to the evidence and then deliberating and making decisions on that evidence that would then inform policy. And the people they listen to is the experts. So they want it to be set up in a way where it's scientists informing the public. So it seems like a really kind of a good idea on paper. Um, it's just probably not ever going to happen quick enough to deal with the things that we're actually the issues we're actually facing. um, and I mean, that's why I've ended up kind of having to step away, because I want to focus on solutions right now, and I think that there is nothing more pressing than immediately sorting some of these issues out, and then then maybe we can look at how do we have a fairer democracy and have those kinds of conversations.
Yeah, and that's why I think, like, because I'm ever since I've learned more about nuclear, I've become almost obsessed with it, and I think nuclear power as a solution could supercharge the kind of activism that people are demanding. Like it could actually we could actually really dramatically um, bring down emissions with this one amazing technology. And if what did you think? What do you think about that?
Well, actually, I mean, yeah, absolutely. But also, I would say that I feel like the stage we're in now, I call it nuclear denial. So when I first joined Extinction Rebellion, I'd been talking about climate change for a long time. And, I did public speaking on it. And I wrote articles about it. I just found that my audiences were slim. It was a difficult topic to interest people in, and for me that was really kind of upsetting, because I could see that it was a really serious thing that needed addressing. And then this group of people came together and founded this movement that brought together all these people who'd been feeling the same way for a long time. And when we started out, climate denial was really common, and I don't just mean in your average person. I mean the way it was represented, for example, on television, when they would have kind of news reports. They'd have some debate afterwards about climate, and they'd have a climate scientist and they'd have a climate denier. And we actually actively campaigned against that. We went and we stood outside the BBC and said, you can't have, we protested saying you can't have climate deniers. You wouldn't have, a doctor and a homeopath. This is ridiculous. And we help to shift that discussion away from climate denial. This is one of the things that I think XR kind of almost unintentionally did, that was one of the most important things that it did, and it's the reason I joined, because I saw that the shift was happening and I threw my energy into it. And now that's done, now that's happened. Yes, there are still some climate deniers out there, but consistently over here, at least, the polls show that people remain worried about the environment, and it's right at the top of the list of things they're worried about, and it's the highest kind of concern we've had ever in our record. So that's really great. We've kind of done that. But when we look at nuclear, this is where this needs to happen now. So I'm writing articles about nuclear power. They're not heavily opinion based. They are talking about the evidence. And I'm really struggling to get them printed. And even with journalists that I've worked with before, who I've met in person, who I have good relationships with, who've previously said, yeah, just send us whatever you want and we'll print it, they've just given me a blanket no, or not even replying to emails. There's like a real fear of talking about nuclear in a positive light. If you look at the articles on nuclear out there, they're almost always anti, even if it's very subtly done, and I don't even think that's always intentional. I think that there's a kind of inherent bias. And yeah, that so absolutely, this is one of the biggest solutions for climate change, for air quality, for poverty eradication around the world. But it's difficult to have that conversation when we're in this kind of denial stage. And what I'm trying to work on is that public shift, just getting the public to shift their perspective of nuclear the way that XR did with climate change.
And that kind of answered the rest of this question. And it's basically, how could climate activism prevent a different narrative?
I don't think that a lot of groups will jump on board with this. Greenpeace have a long history of campaigning against nuclear. Extinction Rebellion are interesting because they don't advocate for specific solutions. And I had a conversation with some of the people in the team after I left, and they completely understood that I stepped away to advocate for nuclear. And they said, look, we're just going to put out a statement saying, because they were getting a lot of inquiries after I left, they said that we'll just put out a statement saying we don't have a view either way. We believe that citizen assembly should decide it. But then a few days later, on Twitter, probably just one of the rogue members who's on the social media team started posting all these kind of pro renewables posts, and it's that kind of inherent bias again. And I sent someone a message and said, they're doing this, and if you can't do it for nuclear, you can't do it for renewables. That really needs unpicking. That people, these green groups, just assume there's just an inherent assumption that renewables are going to fix everything.
Yeah.
And no one's doing it deliberately. I mean, maybe that rogue person was, but even then, I think probably they weren't. Probably they just thought, well, everybody around me agrees, so I'm going to write this. And then those tweets did actually get taken down, because that's not how XR operates, and I have a lot of respect for them for that. But will those organizations ever lobby for nuclear? No, I don't think so. However, what I will say is that from what I'm seeing now, when Extinction Rebellion came into being, there was a lot of kind of steam built up in people. We just kind of harnessed that in a way. We kind of channeled it into action. But people were already concerned, right, about the environment. They were already concerned about climate change. They just didn't have anywhere for that energy to go. And I feel like this is what I'm seeing now, since I kind of came out as pro-nuclear. Surprised a lot of people, upset some people, but ultimately I've had a lot of support from both sides, from people on both sides of the political spectrum, and I think that's important. What I would say is, on the left, it tends to be people who won't say it publicly, but the fact that belief and that energy is there, and that people are getting more frustrated that they want to focus on solutions, does seem to me like there's another narrative coming. I just don't think it will be in any of the existing groups. I think it will have to be something new.
And that's entirely fair.
Yeah, no, I was just gonna say really quick, and I can totally understand the idea of being technology neutral. Like, that's why, I mean, I got in a discussion with my sister, and she's a very big fan of Greta Thunberg, and Greta doesn't really focus her attention on the solutions. She just focuses on the problems. But I think there can also be kind of a a negative psychology, which is kind of goes into our next question.
In which people, especially younger people, will feel hopeless and depressed about the perceived planetary doom that climate change and a lot of other environmental problems can pose to us. Do you think this is more harmful or helpful when it comes to getting young people involved with climate activism?
I think that positivity is needed. I think that climate grief has a role, and I've certainly felt it myself, especially as a mother. And it's kind of a natural response um, to, seeing some of the destruction around the world. And actually, that's not to say that's not been happening for a long time, actually, but in the world we live in now, it's constant, right? You're just constant. I think there's a word for it, doom scrolling, where you're just constantly seeing bad news in your social media, and you're exposed to it all the time. And then if you link all of the things you're seeing, like deforestation or natural disasters, whether or not those natural disasters are linked to climate change, you it adds to your grief. It adds to your feeling of kind of helplessness, and this is an insurmountable problem. And ultimately, grief can be a useful tool if people are using it to kind of process loss. And there is loss, there is species decline. There's really awful predictions for the extinction of different species. But at the same time, I think if it holds you back from action, it's not a very helpful thing. So um, I don't think it should be kind of pushed on people. And there's definitely that kind of narrative. And again, I don't think that anybody's doing it with an agenda to depress everyone. But if you listen to someone like Greta Thunberg, she's angry and she's upset and she's talking about losing her future, that can make you feel really kind of hopeless and depressed. And she is speaking to a lot of younger people. So in terms of kind of helping people process it and come to terms with the realities of climate change, maybe it could be helpful. But I think overall, it's quite harmful. I mean, I've spoken to a lot of young people who have eco anxiety, and it really worries me. And if you look at the statistics, there's really high numbers of children now, and quite young children, who suffer from eco anxiety. And it's just, it's not good, and especially not good if you have nowhere to channel it. And if you're young, the likelihood is that you have nowhere to channel it. So I often say to people, find a community, so that you're not alone with it. Make sure you get help if it's, if you need, actually, if it's so serious you need a therapist. And also just anxiety ultimately is, it works in a fight, flight, or freeze way, right? So you choose. It can be a call of action. You can choose a response ultimately, and if that response is action and it's positive action, then that's great. Then a lot of young people do talk about feeling better. And I think there is some research on this as well, that they feel better when they're engaged with taking action, even if it's only kind of action where you're kind of lowering your own carbon footprint. It doesn't have to be any other kind of activism, and it's because you're kind of controlling, what you're coming to terms with what you can control, um, and instead of just trying to, instead of feeling helpless about all the things you can't control.
Right.
And so I often have these conversations in that way, but at the same time, I think we need to move past the doom and gloom type stuff. I think also, if you think about the people, this is an argument I often had in HR. If you think about the people who are most saying these things, right, about it's going to be really awful, there's going to be climate breakdown, we're going to have food shortages, we're going to, XYZ thing. They're all people who are very privileged, like me. I have access to medication, I have good work, I have, access to food, I'm quite well protected in a lot of ways from things like natural disasters. But if you travel around the world, or if you go to where my parents grew up, in a little village in the Punjab in the north of India, so my parents migrated from there in the 70s, Britain. They already live in that situation. They already live in what we're saying is going to be this kind of awful way. So it's a little bit about having that perspective as well, and just stepping away from this kind of, I mean, I don't know what you'd call it, but just kind of really intensely focused on our well-being, and our future and our children. These are words that are thrown around a lot, and I certainly have felt sad for my children. But then, again, then I've been to this village in India where the mortality rate among children is really high, because they don't have really basic infrastructure and access to things that we have, like medication and hospital care and even food, food if the weather's bad and they can't grow enough food, then that's an issue. Things that I just don't have to worry about. So I think we need to be careful about the way we frame climate change instead of kind of, oh, we're going to suffer, it's going to be really bad for us. Actually, those people on the front line are the people who've already been suffering for quite a long time. And this still comes back to me. This still comes back to energy, right? Because in order for those countries to develop, they now need to do what we did. They need abundant energy, and actually at the same time now the kind of developed world is saying, well, we don't want you to do that. We don't want, because fossil fuels are, adding more gas emissions to the atmosphere, and we know that now. And I'm not saying that we should pump more out, but at the same time we need to be realistic about what they need. And we can't say that and then also say, well, you also can't have nuclear power. We just can't do that, because how else will they be lifted out of poverty? And if we're really saying, that it's so bad to live in this kind of breakdown of society, then you need to go and have a look at how a lot of the world lives. So that doomism is very, coming from this kind of privileged mindset, and I think that a shift needs to happen around that. And it's quite a difficult conversation, but it's one that I've been having a lot, and especially if it holds people back from taking action, because actually we're the people with the most power to take action.
Definitely.
Yeah, and I think there's a spectrum, right? Like, there's the idea of a climate alarmist versus a climate denier. Well, I mean, I think most people are in the middle of being climate realist. Like, if we don't do anything, some terrible things could happen. So, you know, it's better to have an insurance policy to not, you know, let this thing get out of control. And the good thing about it is that, it doesn't have to get out of control. We have a solution to it. And, of course, we're more biased as being pro nuclear, but I certainly feel like nuclear is, I thank God, if there is a God, that we in, invented nuclear fission, because it could be the thing that digs us out of this hole. And they thought the same way in the 50s and 60s. So, but I was just going to ask you, there are many solutions to the greenhouse gas effect, and we need all of them. But would you consider nuclear power as like the keystone technology of mitigation, like maybe the central, you know, like way to do it?
Absolutely. I mean, absolutely. The arguments, the more that I speak to people about it, the more I realize how weak the arguments against it are. I'm not just talking about fear of radiation, fear of waste, even things like people saying, oh, well, they take a long time to build. Well, you know what? If we'd built more nuclear 30 years ago, we wouldn't be in this position. you know,
Right.
that's really the way we need to think about it. It's even more of a reason to do it now. That's not a reason to say, oh, well, it will take too long. We should be grateful that we have a solution, and that also this solution can be applied to people around the world who still need energy, who aren't in a position where they just have the internet and they have lights that they can switch on after dark, because a lot of people don't have that. They need to have something, right? And actually what's happening is a lot of those places are being given renewables, and
They
I'm
need
not.
refrigeration.
Absolutely.
They need what's another thing? Electric heaters. They need to be able to have electric stoves. All these things they need.
And there are issues now, like in India, where more and more people are relying on air conditioning because it's getting so
Right.
hot. They're having more heat waves, and it's kind of like, well, where's that energy coming from? They're not coming from clean sources. So, um, and our position over here of being very anti-nuclear, people being very anti-nuclear, and people protesting, it does have an impact. So I don't know if you're following what's happened. Germany closing down their plants, and now
Right.
France has now done it with Fessenheim. The oldest reactor running for something like 50 years. No reason, absolutely no reason to
It's
shut it down.
absurd.
Exactly. And at the same time, then as happened with Germany, then their emissions start to go back up again. It's utterly irresponsible at this stage, because the people that actually need to go to develop are not being allowed to do it, because we don't, we're encouraging them not to, but at the same time we're not really giving them any other options. Renewables aren't the option. This is where, it's a really difficult conversation to have, because renewable energy has so many
Limitations.
advocates. Well, but advocates who don't understand that there are limitations and don't want to
Right.
admit that there are limitations. And I just say, you cannot just tell these people that they can have solar panels on their roof and that they can develop in the way that we developed. It's just not like no amount of numbers would add up to that. Just look at the numbers, and some people just won't shift on it at all. I've had that experience. But I'm hoping that by talking about it more, we can have more of a debate around it, and that we can help shift that kind of just standard anti-nuclear sentiment and standard pro-nuclear sentiment. There's got to be a balance in the debate.
Right, and, just a interesting effect, it's like, if we don't do nuclear now, we're gonna lock in coal today or tomorrow, and people don't understand that people will burn whatever's cheapest. They will do whatever's cheapest to give their people a quality of life, and if that's gonna be coal, it's gonna be coal, and, the United States, we were on track to like, people were excited to get rid of coal, um, and there was, like, Colby, correct me if I'm wrong, but it was like, if we continued our pre-Three Mile Island trajectory of nuclear, we would have been completely, carbon-free electric grid by 2000.
There was one study that basically indicated more than a 90% displacement of fossil fuels. I believe it was up until 2010 for the United States, and
2010, okay.
a similar progression for the rest of the world too.
Yeah, and then just, I'm kinda rambling here, but back to, like, when we talk about these closures, every time they close a nuclear power plant, I mean, my heart just sinks because 'cause I'm just like, "Look, we are losing huge quantities of carbon-free electricity," and at some point, I'm like, "Where are the progressives and where are the Democrats, talking about keeping these plants open?" So
The
it's
issue, in my experience, the issue is that people, when you say, "Well, look, this is a zero carbon technology," they say, "So are renewables." That's really the issue. That they already
Mhm.
believe, they have this misconception, and then I say, "Well, all right, let's look at how much land, a wind farm will take to create the same amount of energy as this kind of compact nuclear site over here." And I've seen people's jaws drop, when you actually show them the numbers, when you actually get to that point. And there have been people who've changed their minds, including people in some of these activist groups that I've worked with for a long time, which is why I think there's hope that more people kind of start coming out publicly and advocating. But again, it just can't happen soon enough, because until that shift happens, these plants will keep closing, because the anti-nuclear lobby is very strong. It's very embedded in green politics and in green activism.
Even the fossil fuel
Yes.
industry.
Of course, in the fossil fuel industry,
Yeah.
because they benefit from it.
Yeah.
So to follow up with the scientific citation here, yeah, the study is called "Nuclear Power Learning and Deployment Rates: Disruption and Global Benefits Forgone" by Peter Lang, published in 2017. The particular quote is, "In 2015 alone, nuclear power could have replaced up to 100% of coal generated and 76% of gas generated electricity." So,
It's incredible. It's, Michael, I know you had a conversation with Michael Schellenberger, but, he was basically said, "I felt like I was completely lied to about the technology," and it's almost the
we all were.
I kind of felt the same way. Like, I was always interested like, when I was in 8th grade, I wanted to be a nuclear physicist, and I thought, learning about nuclear bombs and stuff were just cool. I like to understand how atoms worked, you know but then I also, like, learned a little bit about nuclear power, and I was just like, "Oh, well, that's kinda neat." And in college, I wrote a paper in my intro writing class about how, "Oh, we might need to use some nuclear," but, I was told it was dangerous. And when I realized it really was not dangerous and it was the safest, I was just like, "Oh my gosh, this is crazy." Um, so, yeah, I think we could build a, you know a system where people are very interested in nuclear and would want to kind of have it be like one of the central planks of it. And I think that um, we're going to move in that direction. And you know, uh, if and I'm excited about that in the future.
I was just speaking to someone the other day, in another interview, about how it's so. I mean, I wouldn't say that I had been lied to, but I had been duped in the same way that everyone around me was kind of duped, and then they just dupe other people. If you're
Yeah.
in these movements, it's just so, no one's kind of hitting you with hard evidence. No one's kind of trying to convince you to be anti-nuclear. It's just so normal to be that you don't even question it. If your friends are just going off to rallies protesting nuclear, you just assume, just really embedded. I think that comes from kind of lots of different things, but over here, C&D used to be a really big movement. A lot of those people are really active in activism, and that's all about the bomb, and that all of that kind of fear of weapons bleeds into nuclear power, and they don't even really unpick it and think about it. It just becomes a big, we're just anti this. It just becomes really embedded. And so I was surrounded by that for a long time, before I started questioning and looking into research, which not everybody is able to do. um, and not everybody is able to look at just dry numbers and make sense of them, and that's fine. And actually, if you look at science literacy, it's not very high, so you can't really expect it either. I think there need to be more communicators, and therefore, when I've started talking about it, people have actually said, you know what, can you just send me a bit more information, because they're interested, and they
Yep.
they don't want to be duped. They don't, and some of them, sure, will just go straight back to, no, this is what I believe. But actually, there's a surprising number of people who've come forward and said, wow, that's really interesting, I didn't know that. Which is why I feel there's kind of a shift happening, but also that they haven't necessarily intentionally been lied to. It's just become a really, politics is so polarized. It's almost like if you're on this side or you're in this group, you have to believe these things, and you don't even question it. And that's a dangerous thing,
Mhm.
ultimately. And that's what I found with my green parenting book. Is I wrote this book, and then I found, wow, lots of green parents are anti-vaccination. Who knew? um, just kind of hadn't really come up against it before, even though I'd been in that community and speaking at things for a long time. Suddenly I realized, all right, you know what? I don't ascribe to something that this tribe ascribes to, and that makes me a bit of an outlier, makes me different, and now I have to work out how to deal with it. And it's the same thing now with nuclear, where I don't really, I could say that I'm still part of that tribe. I still care about the environment. I still am an activist, but this thing has changed, because it's important for me that ultimately, if there's any tribe I belong to, it's evidence based. Because I just think there's no point in doing anything if you're just going by gut feelings. You could even do more damage, and this has happened where more damage has been done. I don't know if you saw the thing about agroecology in no, not no, sorry, agroecology in Africa, in African farmers. Um, anyway, it's a method that they've been applying there, thinking that they would help people and help lift them out of poverty. And actually, the research now has come back saying it's actually probably keeping them in poverty. Um,
Mm.
and I know lots of people who speak out for agroecology. It's called like the sustainable way to farm, and actually, it's absolutely not. It's absolutely not the right direction to go in, and that's another conversation that we need to have with people.
It's the unintended, consequence of ideology and not facts. So, interestingly, younger people have much less of a negative bias towards nuclear power. If we taught youth about the promise of nuclear power, would that change climate activism for the better?
I think so, and I think that shift is already happening. So a lot of people who have reached out to me from these green movements, who either want to know more or they actually are privately pro-nuclear, do tend to be younger people. In my experience, that's what I found. Um, yeah, it's a real kind of old school thing. The old school activists, the kind of CND, ban the bomb activists, are the ones that seem to be just really entrenched in anti-nuclear ideology, and there's not really any debating with them, sadly. So I'd say, yeah, there's a generational divide, but I think that shift's already happening. It would be great, however, if we're teaching the basics about this kind of stuff, and just really basic engineering as well in schools. I don't know if that will ever happen, but I think it's really,
Mhm.
it would help a lot with helping people to make evidence-based decisions.
The only place I learned about, nuclear power besides my own self-interest was, high school chemistry, and I'm like, Man, they should be talking about, different sources of power in middle school even, or, elementary school, or I guess you you guys would call it primary school, or
Yeah,
I forget, but yeah, it's interesting, and I've actually been to some local Extinction Rebellion, rallies here in Denver, Colorado, where I live, and I was passing out pamphlets and, like, I the people who had the like, you know, most interest were the younger people where they didn't even know much about it. And, of course, there were the veteran kind of old school environmentalists there that were just like, yelling at me is just like, you're trying to poison our kids or something. And I'm just like, the evidence doesn't support that. So, um, and, uh, and another anecdote is I I went to a Bernie Sanders rally. He was running for president, and he was against nuclear. And I had a sign outside the rally that said, "Bernie is wrong to reject nuclear power." And I got a lot of support, and I was so amazed. And I got in a really good conversation with some college age kids, and they're just like, "Yeah, I agree with you," and yeah, he's actually wrong on this issue, and it it was kind of heartwarming.
Yeah, that's been my experience too. That is what I keep saying to people who are afraid to talk about it publicly. That actually, it's not you're not just losing the support of everyone in your kind of tribe. Like actually, there's more support than you think, and there's also this kind of movement of pro nuclear people who are really great. Moving walking into that movement has been a really positive experience. So I'm encouraging people to do it.
So when we talk about like social movements, I I actually kind of agree with a lot of the climate activism. The problem is, and I think a lot of people's frustration is that there's not they aren't people aren't offering solutions. Like when I because I'm on energy like threads online all the time, and one of the biggest complaints to like someone like Greta Thunberg, but again she's only 16 years old, I think 17 now, but um, is she's just like she's like saying she wants us to panic and, you know, the you know, we needed she just calls for change. Well, what kind of change? And in my mind, um, you know, eh, right certain political movements or, major movements, you just need a very clearly defined goal. Like, be it civil rights movement, apartheid, stuff like that. Um, and you know, I was wondering now that the limitations of intermittent renewables are being realized, do you think nuclear could be that new, clearly defined goal?
I think there's still a lot of work to be done with renewables. As I said earlier, people just don't understand that it's intermittent. They don't understand how much space they take up, how expensive they are. Um, there's a lot of kind of myth busting to do around all of that. With Greta, I have a lot of respect for Greta Thunberg and her work. I think it's incredible what she's doing as a young person, but I have seen her um, on Twitter, you know, criticizing coal, which absolutely, completely agree with that. Criticizing, countries that are using fossil fuels, but she's also criticized nuclear. The one thing I haven't seen her criticize is renewables. And so I wonder if there is this kind of similar to what I was saying earlier and happened in XR, where it's just kind of an ideology thing. It's just assumed to be the solution. So I completely respect her saying unite behind the science, but we need to actually make sure that we are presenting evidence-based solutions. And renewables, at the moment, people don't really understand that renewables aren't where it's at, and they're still saying to me things like, oh well, if we funded them more. But if you look at Germany, they put billions, right? They put it's like over $500 billion, right, into their energy wind, as they called it, into renewables, and it wasn't sufficient. It wasn't sufficient, so they had to then go back to using fossil fuels. Their emissions went up after they started closing their nuclear plants. That's also something that people don't seem to know when I tell them about that, and I wonder if that is to do with this kind of nuclear denial bias in the press, that they're not getting this information. Until that happens, there will not be a movement, a social movement that's pro nuclear or really pro evidence. I think that these things are coming together. So one thing I'm working on is Stand Up for Nuclear UK. It's an event that I'm organising for the 12th of September in London. It's bringing together pro-nuclear advocates and science advocates from around the UK. There's a lot of people already interested. We've got speakers, we've got stalls lined up. I mean, a little bit kind of unsure what will happen at the moment, because it looks like we might be going into another lockdown, and that might mean that we have to postpone it. But what I would say is, from that, it does look like there's the energy for a kind of a radical movement. Let's be honest, in environmentalism, the most radical thing would be to be pro-nuclear, because it's so unusual and so different to all of the kind of typical things that environmental movements get behind. It would be radical to have a truly evidence-based movement, but we absolutely need it, and that's where I'm kind of throwing my oar in now, trying to help that come about.
Right. Yeah, exactly. And speaking of like kind of a a, a new goal, did you see that uh, recent like protest outside of Greenpeace, where a bunch of nuclear people were starting to turn against what the nonsense Greenpeace was saying about it? Did you see that?
I did see that. It was outside Greenpeace during the week that they were closing Fessenheim, wasn't it? I think that it's really important that we have more of that, and I think there's more on the horizon. There's a few projects, kind of grassroots projects that I'm involved with that will hopefully go in that direction. But again, we're a little bit restricted, same as Extinction Rebellion is now restricted by COVID, because we can't have mass gatherings. Very difficult to kind of on the streets and protest now. But I think that's what nuclear really really needs. And the March for Science that we had over here a few years ago were really popular and really helped kind of shift people's ideas a little bit on where their alliance, making them pick where their alliance was. Do they just want politicians to go with their ideologies, or do they want science-based solutions? And that that was a very popular movement over here. I took my children on a march for science up here. It was really busy, it was great. um, but can we do that for more specific solutions? That would be that's kind of something that I'm working on. And also I think that is the next move for social activism. Like you say, with the suffragettes, they had ultimately one goal, get women the right to vote, or you know, many examples of many different social movements that I've picked one thing and have campaigned heavily on it. And I think actually kind of Exile could have done this because they had their um, nuclear net zero by 2025, but they also had citizen assemblies. And I actually, this is one of my criticisms when I was in the organization, was it's almost too many things. Like, just pick one thing. And because even calling for net zero, especially at an earlier date, is already, that's lots of different solutions, right? It's not just one
Yep.
thing. So actually, unless you're picking a few policies that you're going to fight for, it's already a little bit too abstract for most people. And the science really needs to be broken down. I don't mean in a kind of, making people sit through presentations way, but just having that, making sure that shift happens where people understand really basic things like where renewables are at. That it's not anti-renewables to just say, look, the battery capacity isn't there. It's not, look at what's happened with the projects like in Germany, where they have put lots of money into it. And then let's myth bust nuclear. Let's look at, unpick people's fears of radiation and waste, all of the things that they have that actually often are kind of not based, they're not based on evidence. They've come from like cultural representations of things, or they're mixing their feelings up with weapons, or they're just in a group where the anti-nuclear sentiment is really high, so they just go with it. It's really about shifting that and shifting towards more evidence. And I think that's a really exciting thing, because it's not really happened before. You think that it would have, but it hasn't. Science communication has been around for a long time, but it hasn't. It's only recently that I've seen this kind of real shift of people becoming interested in it, and more scientists coming out. And this was, largely because of climate change. I think climate scientists coming out and saying, right, I'm going to actually speak about these issues, whereas before I might have just kind of stuck to just crunching the numbers. I'm actually going to go and do public facing stuff. And that's really imperative that we get more nuclear physicists and engineers doing that. And also that, maybe there's some communications training involved, because sometimes the way that things are communicated can have the opposite effect if it's not done in a positive way.
Right, and I think, uh, what's good is just to have calm, rational discussions with people, be like, "What do we know? Climate change is the problem. What's causing it? Fossil fuels. Okay, now that we know that, what are the solutions?" And what I go around is, like, at climate marches and stuff, because I am a climate activist, is I have, like, a sign that says, "Support all sources of clean energy." And I put nuclear, I put hydro, I put wind, I put solar, I put geothermal, because that because that kind of uh, visual messaging, I think, has an effect on people. Because then they're just like, "Oh, I never really thought about nuclear." Well, okay, let's throw that in the basket of solutions. And, I think as if we focus on all the different carbon-free technologies and costs and benefits of each one, and just kind of have a, kind-hearted discussion with people about it, I think, you know, climate activism could start to get extremely effective, and the fossil fuel industry would start shaking in their boots, you know? We kind of talked a little bit about this, but if we could describe a new type of climate activism that centers around abundant energy technology like nuclear, which advocates for lifting up humanity versus austerity measures, uh, you know, what would this look like to you?
Well, I think this does exist, and it's the eco-modernist movement. I don't know if you know
Right?
about that. It's really popular and been really successful in Finland, where they have an eco-modernist in each of the main political parties. And that I've spoken to that team. They got in touch with me after they read my letter, my City AM letter about why I was now campaigning for nuclear, and they kind of were really interested in um, yeah, my stance and where Britain's at in that kind of um, pro science realm, because they've had huge success over the years in Finland in getting evidence based solutions kind of on the agenda. And yeah, we've had some really interesting conversations about that. I don't know whether some of it is cultural as well, and that it's been successful there because it really appeals to people culturally. Over here, I know that eco-modernism kind of gets a bad rap. It's been when it was launched years ago, it was quite heavily criticized in the press by a lot of kind of mainstream Greens, and I don't know if it can be reclaimed from that or whether we need something new. Um, but I feel like the moment's here for that to happen. And
Right.
especially kind of in the wake of COVID, and people just feeling really, like there's been a lot of mixed messaging about it. The research, we didn't know a lot about it in the beginning, but as I was informed because I listened to podcasts and I follow lots of scientific newsletters, and so I was seeing the research come in. I could see when there was more evidence about how um, masks work, how masks help to prevent you from spreading COVID-19, and things like how social distancing works, and you know I was aware of the research, and what I was finding was people were really confused by what they were hearing from the government. And I think the government was trying really hard to communicate different things, and it was really mixed messages, and people found it really frustrating. And more people were going then to their own sources, to look things up, which can be dangerous, right? Because they might just be reading someone's blog, which is just telling you lies or conspiracies. But ultimately, I think they were just trying to do the right thing, and they really wanted to know, all right, what is the evidence? And that that to me is a really positive thing, that actually they're kind of trying to take it into their own hands and say, what can we actually do that is going to stop the spread of this thing? Now, if we just need to apply that thinking on a longer term scale with climate change. I mean, that's, as you said, that's all it is about getting those greenhouse gas emissions down. And if we just have a list of solutions that can do that all over the world, then we've got it in the bag. Basically, it's not more complicated than that. What's complicated is all the ideology and the politics and the poor communication around the solutions. That's holding us back at the moment. So I feel like we might be in a moment now where that will change, and partly because there's a lot of we've learned a lot of lessons, I think, from the communications around COVID and the way that people have reacted around the world. And I know that America has had some extreme reactions to mask wearing, for example, and how that could be prevented, and how to actually communicate information to people in a way that leads to positive change.
But yeah, like the idea of evidence-based policy is actually kind of a newer concept, and I think the more advanced we get as a society, the more we will have to just look at data for everything we do. And that's what I think eco-modernism is beautiful. It's it's an alternative that can include so many people from different, you know, political spectrums and stuff because it's just looking at science and you know what can we do to just limit our impact on nature by basically leaving it alone. And I think it's great, and I know some people are like, I don't a guy there's one friend of mine in, Australia, his name is Ben Hurd. He's a big eco-modernist, and he says, he doesn't really call himself an environmentalist anymore. He just says, he calls himself an eco-modernist, and, you know, its philosophy is great too because it's all about, getting people out of poverty and stuff like that. So I think eco-modernism is is definitely the beginning of the movement to, you know, peace to coexist with nature in a way that not it actually goes against coexisting, but allows us to cherish and let nature heal, going forward.
I'm definitely interested in it. I'm interested in, I was talking about tribes, and when people have a view in their tribe that doesn't match everybody else's views, they might just ignore it or might be afraid to speak about it because they don't want to lose their tribe. That's a natural kind of evolutionary thing, right? Where, if you did that, you could, be ousted from your tribe and then your likelihood of survival would go down. So it's kind of natural in a way, and I understand that. Um, and so eco-modernism, in my mind, can offer people that space. So if they're leaving their tribe, they have that space to go into. So I was a bit of an outlier doing what I did, leaving Extinction Rebellion, coming out for nuclear, not really knowing whether I'd get any support. And now I found that there is an incredible group of people, but it's not, it's not in any kind of collective. It doesn't really have a name. And some people need that,
Right, so
and
it's
eco-modernism offers that. But I'm interested in why in some places it's really popular, like Finland, it's really taken off, and then places like here just completely didn't take off, and people said, oh, we don't agree with that because it's just focusing on technological solutions. There's something to unpick there as well about why people who have benefited so exponentially from technological solutions would feel that way.
Zion, do you have any final thoughts, and, uh, where can listeners learn more about you?
You can find me on Twitter at Ziontree, ZIONTREE, or through my website, which is just www.zionlights.co.uk. Final thoughts. I think that we're in a really great moment where things are shifting, things are happening, and people like me have been waiting for this for a long, long time. I've been interested in evidence and data for a long time. They're just in the kind of circles I was in, it didn't seem like those things were important, and I think that is changing. And I don't know whether it will be that ecomodernism grows or whether we can reclaim that to some degree. I don't know whether we need more grassroots movements, campaigning for nuclear. That's something that I'm working on as well. But I do feel like something is going to come out of this, and that in a way, it can't come soon enough because emissions continue to rise. Our greenhouse gas emissions continue to rise, and really, we just need to pool our thoughts and ideologies together and understand that we just have this one planet. We just have this one habitable planet in the known universe, and we need to get our ducks in a row and just sort out this completely solvable problem. Put aside the squabbling, put aside the ideology that's holding us back, and create something better for our children and future generations.
Definitely, I, can't agree more with what you said. And that's what all it comes down to is what's the common goal, and to build coalitions. And you are really doing, you are really making a difference, by kind of coming out in favor of nuclear like this, and kind of switching gears and wanting to find a better way. And I think once we start to realize that there is a better way, we can finally solve the problem. Uh, and I just want to say, thanks for taking time out of your schedule to talk to us.
It was my pleasure. Thanks for having me on the podcast.
Well, that was a valuable conversation with Xeon. She offered some really insightful perspective into the world of activism and how we can change it for the better. Again, we want to thank her for the important work she is doing, following the evidence wherever she goes.
Definitely. Just talking to her is so inspiring and gives us a reason to have great hope for the future. Eventually, I think the climate movement and greater environmental movement will see the truth about nuclear power. Once they do, I think a large paradigm shift may occur away from eco anxiety and towards eco optimism. Colby, what did you like best about the conversation?
Well, nuclear is often omitted in the discussion about fighting climate change, and it's vital that we put it on the table. And I'm glad that Xeon is not only bringing attention to this technology as a solution, but is also actively promoting it as an essential solution. Climate change is a global problem, and so is poverty, which is why nuclear is so important, as it can be the solution to both of these issues at the same time. A new narrative in climate activism is needed, one that recognizes energy poverty as a problem and not an agenda for enforced austerity under the use less mantra. I'm grateful Xeon is coming forward and bringing light to these issues. How about you, Phil? What did you like best in the conversation?
Honestly, I'm very thrilled another accomplished and well known environmental activist had the courage to say and agree that nuclear power really should be the cornerstone technology in any climate mitigation strategy. The literal math checks out, given the very physics of the technology. Oftentimes, folks say they want nuclear just to be one of the strategies of decarbonization. I think nuclear deserves much more space than that. It is of my personal opinion that nuclear power is the optimum solution to the climate crisis. Yes, we need all technology, but I think nuclear has the most important role to play. That's my 2 cents anyway. So that's about it for this month's podcast called A New Type of Climate Activist. We want to say thanks to Xeon and thank you, listeners, for tuning in.
If you like what you heard and want more content, you can support Americans for Nuclear Energy's Climate Fix podcast on a per episode basis with Patreon. Link in the description. To support Americans for Nuclear Energy and our general mission, visit our website at americansfornuclearenergy.org. All words. Again, that's americansfornuclearenergy.org. We have a link to donate with PayPal under the Mobilize page. You can also purchase Americans for Nuclear Energy swag under our store page. This will really help us pay for the little things, especially online service fees to keep our organization running.
You can follow us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, Tumblr, and YouTube. Lastly, we really want your feedback. Let us know your thoughts, questions, and concerns. We have a message form on our website under the About section, or you can email us directly at main@americansfornuclearenergy.org. All words. Again, that's main@americansfornuclearenergy.org. Thanks for tuning into this episode. This is Phil Ord
And Colby Kirk.
of Americans for Nuclear Energy's Climate Fix podcast. We'll see you next time.
Audio editing and production by Jonna Adams.